Zane Ellington didn't believe in fate, but standing in the middle of a crowded Manhattan street with a shattered phone in one hand and half a coffee dripping down his custom-tailored coat, he was starting to think something was seriously off with the universe. "Sir, are you okay?" a soft voice asked. He looked up, irritated and already late for a board meeting. A woman stood there, holding out a napkin with both hands, her eyes wide and concerned. She couldn't have been older than 25, her strawberry blonde hair messily tied back, flour dusting her cheek like she'd come straight from a bakery. She wore a faded green apron, sneakers that had seen better days, and not a single trace of pretense. Zane didn't have time for this. Or people like her. He made time for numbers, mergers, and eliminating distractions. Especially the kind that smelled faintly like cinnamon and compassion. "I'm fine," he snapped, brushing off his coat. "It's just coffee." She held out the napkin anyway.
"Still, I've got more inside."
"I work at the cafe right there." He looked at the tiny corner shop behind her Laurel and loaf. He'd passed it 100 times. Never once stepped inside. "I don't need. You're dripping on your shoes," she said gently, eyes flicking down to his Italian leather loafers. Zane hesitated. She wasn't pushy. Just
kind.
Which was rare in this city. He took the napkin. "Thanks." Her smile lit up her whole face. "You're welcome." He should have walked away. Should have turned and headed toward his car where his driver was probably having a meltdown. But something made him pause. "You work there?" he asked, nodding at the cafe.
"Yeah."
"I'm Laurel. My parents named me after the tree, not the cafe. Though it's a happy coincidence." He raised an eyebrow. "You run it. Own it," she said proudly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Well, kind of. Saving to buy the whole space. Right now, I just rent the kitchen hours and take home tips." Zane didn't know what possessed him next. Maybe it was the fact that for the first time all week someone had looked at him like a person, not a paycheck. Maybe it was the way her voice didn't tremble when she spoke to him, despite the fact that his watch cost more than most people's rent. "Do you make anything that doesn't taste like cardboard?" She laughed. "Come in and find out."
He did.
It was only supposed to be 5 minutes.
10, maximal.
But 30 minutes later, he was sitting at a small table with a plate of warm apple scones in front of him and a woman who didn't care who he was, asking about his favorite childhood dessert. "Why does that matter?" he asked, staring at her like she was from another planet. "Because food is about memory," she said, pouring him another cup of house-made chai. "You want to know someone? Ask them what their grandma used to bake." He didn't answer. She didn't push. When he finally stood to leave, he reached for his wallet. "Nope," she said, pushing his hand away. "This one's on me." He blinked. "You don't even know my name. You don't need a name to deserve kindness." Zane stared at her, stunned. No one in his world gave anything for free.
Not time.
Not favors. Not pastries. He walked out without saying another word. The next morning, he found himself standing outside Laurel and Loaf again. And the next. By the 4th day, she was waiting for him with a warm croissant and a sarcastic, "Let me guess your billion-dollar empire runs better on my baked goods." He never corrected her about the millionaire thing. He didn't want to ruin it. He liked being just Zane. Until the day she followed him outside with a paper bag and slipped on a patch of ice. He caught her before she hit the ground, his arms steady around her waist, their faces inches apart. "You okay?" he asked. Her breath hitched.
"Yeah, just."
Not used to being caught. He didn't let go right away.
Neither did she.
That night, he sat in the back of his chauffeured car, staring at the skyline and thinking about her hands, how soft they felt when she pressed a napkin into his palm. How she didn't know who he was. Or didn't care. He had meetings with government officials, a private jet waiting in the morning, and 3 assistants trying to rearrange his schedule. But all he could think about was her. The girl who gave him free pastries. The girl who didn't ask for anything. The girl who didn't know she'd just changed everything. The next time Laurel saw Zane, it wasn't at her café. It was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, of all places, and he was wearing a three-piece suit like he'd been cut from marble and stitched into silk. She'd only come for the final day of an exhibit on Renaissance baking tools niche. Yes, but fascinating to her, and there he was, standing beneath a marble archway, speaking with a man whose shoes probably cost more than her entire month's rent. Zane caught her eye mid-sentence. His stare didn't falter, not for a beat. Laurel. His voice was quieter when he reached her, but his eyes still held that intense, unreadable focus. Didn't think I'd see you here. I could say the same, she replied, clutching the strap of her canvas tote. I didn't peg you for the museum type. I'm not. He glanced over his shoulder. Board member event. Obligatory appearances. You? Historical baking implements. I'm a nerd for them. That pulled something like amusement from him, not laughter, not a smile, but a shift in his expression she hadn't seen before. A softening. And here I thought I was the most unusual person in this building. You still might be, she said, tilting her head. You look like you belong in a glass case labeled "Do Not Touch." His brow lifted, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he slipped his hands into his coat pockets like he wasn't surrounded by half the city's elite, like he wasn't wearing a watch that could pay off her student loans. Come with me, he said suddenly. To where? There's a closed-off section upstairs. Private access. You'd like it. I didn't bring a gown or a secret handshake. I brought both. She looked at him like he was speaking another language. Why are you being nice to me? He shrugged, and for the first time, he looked almost uncertain. You gave me a napkin? That's a low bar for gratitude. He leaned closer, voice quiet. In my world, kindness is a currency, and people charge interest. Laurel didn't know what to say to that, so she followed him. The private exhibit was behind a velvet rope and 2 security guards. Zane didn't flash a badge or drop a name. He just nodded once, and they parted like curtains. The room was silent, lit only by skylight and soft recessed bulbs. Inside were displays of ancient kitchen relics, things she'd only seen in books. A copper sugar mold from the 1600s. A butter churn carved from ivory. A spice chest inlaid with mother of pearl. She didn't speak for a long time. Zane watched her the way someone might study weather patterns, curious, alert, waiting for a shift. This, she breathed, tracing the air near a delicate pastry stamp, is like walking through time. You see beauty in things most people overlook. She turned to him. And what do you see? Risk, potential, leverage. Do you ever look at something and just enjoy it? His pause was brief but telling. Not often. She studied him now, really studied. He stood still, controlled, as if even in a room full of relics, he was the most valuable thing present, and he knew it. You're not used to people saying no to you, are you? He didn't flinch. No, then you won't like me very much. I already do. It wasn't a line. It wasn't coded in charm or pretense. It was just a fact. Plain and quiet and dangerous. Laurel's heart beat harder, but she ignored it. Tell me something real, she said, crossing her arms. Not about your job. Not about your money. Something no one else knows. He hesitated, not out of reluctance, but calculation. Then, I haven't had a full night's sleep in over 8 years. She blinked. Why? Because silence makes me remember things I'd rather forget. Laurel didn't ask what. She didn't need to. Instead, she stepped closer and whispered, then maybe what you need isn't silence. Maybe it's noise from the right person. Zane stared at her for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I think you might be the first person who's ever said that to me without wanting something in return. She tilted her head. Well, give me time. that drew a rare expression from him, one that hovered somewhere between disbelief and awe. He offered her his arm. "There's a rooftop above this wing. No one uses it after 6. Laurel looked at him, at the man who had started as a stranger with coffee on his coat and now stood before her, offering secrets like they were currency. Against her better judgment, she took his arm. "Lead the way, Mr. Mystery." And for the first time in years, Zane Ellington didn't think about his schedule, his meetings, or the empire waiting to be micromanaged. He thought only of the woman beside him and the rooftop waiting above. And how strange it was that a paper napkin had unraveled his entire world. The wind on the rooftop tugged at Laurel's ponytail as she leaned over the low stone railing, looking out at the city below. The skyline glittered like a constellation made of steel and ambition, stretching into the dark like it had no end. Zane stood a few paces behind her, silent, hands in his coat pockets, but she could feel his attention like a current in the air. "This view costs more than most people make in a year," Laurel said, eyes still fixed on the shimmering horizon. Zane stepped beside her, his voice low. "And yet most of the people who stand here don't actually see it." She turned toward him. "Do you?" "I used to, before it all started blending together." Laurel studied him. "What made it start?" Zane didn't answer right away. He pulled off his gloves and traced a single finger along the edge of the stone ledge, as if writing something only he could read. "I built my first company out of a storage unit in Newark," he said finally. "Cold concrete walls. No heat. I slept there for 3 months. Ate vending machine food. Showered at a gym down the street." Laurel blinked, surprised.
Why?
"Because it was the only way I could afford to keep going." His eyes drifted outward. "I had this idea that if I made enough money, I'd finally breathe easy. But all it did was make the air thinner." She leaned her elbow on the ledge. "So you traded sleep for suits." His mouth lifted, just slightly. "And peace for profit." Laurel hesitated, then asked, "What happened to the storage unit?" "I bought the whole building. Turned it into a data hub. But I kept the room. Left the cot exactly where it was."
Why?
"To remind myself where I came from." Laurel nodded slowly. "And yet you still can't sleep." Zane's gaze dropped to the street far below. "Some things don't leave, no matter how far you climb." They stood in silence, the hum of traffic drifting up like a distant heartbeat. Then Laurel said, "I used to think success meant finally owning a bakery with a window full of cakes and a line out the door. Now I just want to not panic every time rent is due." Zane looked at her. "How close are you to owning it?" She exhaled. "Closer than I was last year, but still a long way off. The landlord wants to sell, and I'm not exactly his first choice. There's a couple from out of town who want to turn the space into a boutique wine bar. You've been there for years, haven't you?" 3, officially. But I've been baking since I was 9. My dad used to say I could turn flour into a home." Zane tilted his head. "Where is he now?" "Passed away 2 years ago," she said softly. "Heart failure. He taught me everything. Even after he got sick, he'd sit at the counter and taste test everything I made." Zane's expression shifted subtly, his jaw tightening. "I never knew mine." Laurel turned to him fully. "Not even a name?" "Only the one he left off my birth certificate." Her breath caught, but she didn't offer condolences. She could tell he wouldn't want them. Instead, she asked, "So your empire started from a storage unit and a missing father?" "And a lot of very expensive mistakes," he said. "Let me guess. You bought a sports car before your first legal team?" 2, actually. Both lemon yellow. I was 22 and stupidly proud." She laughed, and it was the first time the rooftop didn't feel so cold. Zane looked at her, then said, "You're different." Laurel raised a brow. "Because I don't care about your bank account."
No.
"Because you make me forget I have one." Her smile faded. That's a dangerous thing to say. Only if it's untrue. She searched his face, trying to read what lay beneath the surface. What are you doing, Zane? I don't know yet, he admitted. But I don't want to stop. Laurel took a step back. This isn't a game. I'm not someone you can collect like a painting or a penthouse. I know. I don't have time for distractions. I'm fighting for something real. Something that matters. So am I, he said quietly. She stared at him, heart pounding. Then prove it. Zane didn't reach for her. He didn't offer promises or platitudes. He just nodded once, solemn and sure. I will. They left the museum separately. Laurel walked home through quiet streets, her coat pulled tight, her mind racing. She didn't know what she'd just stepped into, only that it felt like standing on the edge of something vast, something that could either lift her higher than she'd ever dreamed or swallow her whole. The next morning, she opened the cafe early, like always. But when she flipped the sign to open, there was a small box on the doorstep, wrapped in butcher's paper and tied with twine. No name. No note. Inside was a vintage French rolling pin walnut wood, perfectly balanced, the kind only found at antique auctions she could never afford. She stared at it for a long time, fingers trembling. Then she looked up, out the window, and saw a black sedan parked across the street. Zane was inside, watching. He didn't get out. He just nodded once through the glass and drove away. The next time Laurel saw Zane, he wasn't standing outside the cafe or sitting quietly in the corner with tea and a pastry. He was in the middle of a real estate office, flanked by 2 lawyers and a woman in a pinstriped blazer who looked like she hadn't blinked since the recession. Laurel froze in the doorway, uncertain whether to step forward or walk right back out. She hadn't been expecting to see him here, not in the office, where the sale of her cafe's building was being finalized. Zane stood when he saw her. Laurel. She didn't move. What are you doing here? The woman beside him offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Ellington is here to finalize the acquisition. The property has been pulled from the open market. Laurel's stomach dropped. You bought it? Zane nodded once. Yes. Her voice turned sharp. Why? Because it would have gone to someone else by the end of the week. You were going to lose it. You had no right. His expression didn't change. You asked me to prove I wasn't playing games. I asked you to be real. Not to make decisions for me behind closed doors. I didn't do it behind your back, he said calmly. I did it before someone else could. She stepped closer, her voice low. I don't need to be rescued. He met her gaze without flinching. I didn't rescue you. I gave you a choice. Laurel stared at him, pulse thudding in her ears. And what exactly do you expect in return? Nothing, he said. The deed is in your name. Her breath caught. What? He gestured to the table. It's yours. No strings. No contracts. Just a clean title. You'll own the whole building. Upstairs, downstairs, kitchen, everything. I'm not your landlord. I'm not even legally tied to it. She looked at the papers, then back at him. You can't do that. I already did. Laurel turned to the woman at the desk. Is this real? The lawyer nodded. As of 10 minutes ago, yes. All the paperwork is in order. He wired the payment in full. Laurel's throat tightened. Why would you do this? Zane stepped closer, his voice quiet. Because I've never wanted anything more than I want to see you win. She looked away, overwhelmed. You can't just drop into my life and rewrite my story. I didn't rewrite it. I just made sure you didn't lose your pen. Laurel walked out without another word. She didn't speak to him for 3 days. Not when he sent a bouquet of sunflowers to the cafe. Not when a delivery of new kitchen equipment arrived with a note that simply said, use it if you want. Or don't. Not when a jazz trio appeared outside her storefront one morning, playing softly while customers lined up on the sidewalk. But on the 4th night, after closing, She found herself locking the cafe door and turning to see him standing across the street. No car, no suit, just jeans and a worn jacket, like he'd stepped out of someone else's life.
She walked to him.
I didn't say thank you, she said. I didn't do it for that. I know. But you still deserve to hear it. Zane's voice was careful. You were always going to make it. I just sped up the process. Laurel hesitated. You scare me sometimes. He frowned.
Why?
Because you move through the world like the rules don't apply to you. And I've spent my whole life trying not to break any. I don't think we're that different. You don't.
No.
You build things with your hands. I build them with numbers. But we both build. And we both bleed when they fall. Laurel looked up at him, something fragile unfolding in her chest. You're not who I thought you were. Most people think I'm a machine. You're not. He reached out then, not to touch her, but to offer his hand. Then let me be something else. With you. She stared at him, the city buzzing around them, and slowly placed her hand in his. Zane didn't speak again. He just walked beside her, down the quiet street, their fingers intertwined like it had always been that way. Weeks later, Laurel stood in her newly expanded kitchen, surrounded by the soft whir of mixers and the scent of caramel and crushed almonds. The cafe was busier than ever, the lines stretching out the door. But she wasn't overwhelmed. She was ready. Zane arrived late that day, slipping through the back entrance like he belonged there.
He did now.
Not as a partner. Not as a benefactor. Just as the man who had chosen to stay without asking for anything. She handed him a small pastry box without a word. He opened it to find a single raspberry tart, the crust hand-piped and glazed to a mirror sheen. He raised a brow. What's the occasion? Laurel smiled. You once asked about my favorite childhood dessert. That was it. His expression softened. And now? She leaned in, lips brushing against his jaw. Now it's what I eat with you. That night, they didn't talk about business or buildings or anything that could be measured in profit. They talked about recipes and old records and the way the world sometimes gave you exactly what you didn't know you needed. Zane had thought he didn't have time for love. He'd built a life around the idea that connection was a liability. But then came a napkin. A scone. A girl who refused to be impressed by his title. And she didn't just change his schedule. She changed everything. The gala was not Laurel's idea. In fact, when Zane first mentioned it briefly, like he was testing the waters, she'd laughed and said she'd rather scrub grout with a toothbrush than spend a night in heels surrounded by people who probably didn't know the difference between brioche and babka. But he'd only said, it's not about them. It's about you. And somehow, that changed everything. Now she stood in front of the mirror in a room that didn't feel like hers, wrapped in silk the color of moonlight, watching her reflection with something between disbelief and wonder. The dress had arrived earlier that afternoon, delivered by someone who addressed her as Miss Hastings and bowed slightly before handing over the garment bag. She hadn't asked how Zane knew her exact size, or that silver was the one color that made her feel like she belonged somewhere she didn't. The car that picked her up had doors that opened automatically, and the man driving wore white gloves. She didn't ask questions. She just held her breath and followed the path Zane had laid out, one detail at a time. When she stepped into the ballroom at the top of the Ellington building, her first thought was that she didn't belong here. Her second was that he did. Zane stood near the grand staircase, back to the marble column, black tux crisp and perfect, his expression unreadable. But the second he saw her, everything shifted. The conversations around him faded. The weight in his shoulders lifted. He crossed the floor with the kind of purpose that didn't need words. You're early, he said when he reached her. You sent a car, she replied, smoothing invisible creases from her skirt. I wasn't about to keep the driver waiting. That's considerate of you. I figured if I showed up too late, you'd have time to change your mind. Zane's gaze didn't waver. I haven't changed my mind about you once. A string quartet played somewhere behind them, soft and elegant. Waiters passed with champagne flutes balanced on crystal trays. Laurel caught glances from women in couture and men who looked like they kept banks in their back pockets. But none of it mattered. Not when Zane's hand slid into hers like it belonged there. He led her to the center of the room. She expected to be tucked away at a corner table, maybe introduced quietly to someone polite and forgettable. Instead, Zane stepped onto the small stage near the head of the ballroom, pulled a microphone from its stand, and said, "If I could have your attention for a moment." The room quieted instantly. Laurel froze. "I know we don't usually do speeches at this event," he continued, voice steady, "but tonight is different." She tried to step back. He caught her hand and held it firmly. "Tonight, I wanted to acknowledge someone who reminded me what it means to build something with your own hands. Someone who taught me that success isn't about numbers or names, it's about heart. About grit. About showing up every day even when the world tells you you're not enough." There was a murmur in the room, an undercurrent of curiosity. Zane turned slightly toward her. "Laurel Hastings, your cafe redefined the way I see value. Your belief in your craft, in your community, in yourself, that's the kind of legacy I want to be part of." She stared at him, stunned. "I spent years accumulating wealth," he went on. "But it wasn't until I met you that I understood what it meant to invest in something real. In someone real." A hush fell over the room. Then, in front of New York's most powerful, Zane stepped down from the stage, walked to her in full view of everyone, and dropped to one knee. Laurel's heart stopped. "I'm not asking you to change for me," he said, voice low but certain. "I'm asking you to let me stand beside you while you keep changing the world in your way. Will you marry me?" The answer left her lips before she could think. "Yes." The room erupted in applause, but Laurel didn't hear it. She only felt the way his arms wrapped around her, the way his breath caught against her shoulder, the way he whispered her name like it was the only thing that had ever mattered. Later that night, long after the last guest had gone and the champagne had been cleared, they stood on the balcony high above the city, the skyline stretching in every direction. Laurel leaned into his side. "You know this is insane, right?" "No," he said. "What's insane is that I almost missed it." She looked up. "Missed what?" "You." He paused. "The life I didn't know I was allowed to want." She kissed him, slow and certain. "Then let's build it. Together." And they did. Not with blueprints and contracts, but with early mornings and burnt scones, laughter in crowded kitchens, and quiet moments when the rest of the world faded away. Laurel expanded the cafe, opened a second location across the river, and started a mentorship program for underfunded young bakers. Zane helped rewrite the business model, but only when asked. He spent more time in her kitchen than in boardrooms, rolling up his sleeves and learning the difference between folding and stirring. He burned the first dozen batches, but Laurel never let him quit. They married one spring morning in the garden behind the cafe, surrounded by wildflowers and a handful of people who didn't care about net worths or stock options. Laurel wore a tea-length dress and no shoes. Zane wore a tie she'd picked out. He said his vows without notes, but with tears in his eyes. Years later, Laurel stood behind the counter of her flagship store, a toddler on her hip and flower on her cheek, as Zane walked in carrying 2 coffees and a paper bag. "I brought the good croissants," he said. She smiled. "You always do." And in that moment, surrounded by the scent of cinnamon and the sound of a life they had built from nothing but a napkin and a choice, they were exactly where they were meant to be. Together.